The skin is the largest organ in the human body, and it plays a major role in human health. It's your best protection against infection and physical damage from the outside world. It also helps regulate body temperature via sweating. The skin is also a reservoir that stores about 5% of our blood volume. Its ability to perform these functions and more is related to its anatomy. In this video, we'll look at models of the skin from the A&P lab at Bristol to get familiar with the structures of the skin. These are the same models that will be on your lab practical, so it's worth it to take a bit of time to review the structures on your lab practical review sheet and compare them to the models. Your objective in this video is to identify the structures of the skin. For each slide in this video, I'm going to have a copy of the terms that you need for your lab practical and your quizzes on the right side of the slide. As we identify the structures on the models, I'll check them off so that you can kind of follow along with what we're looking at. The first structure that you're responsible for knowing is the epidermis. The epidermis is the most superficial layer of the skin. On this particular model, it's located here. The epidermis is made up of 5 layers. The first layer is called the stratum corneum, and it consists of a number of layers of dead keratinocytes. If we're talking about thin skin, then we'll have a few layers of these dead keratinocytes, but if it's thick skin, then we'll have multiple layers. In this particular model, we're looking at thick skin. The reason I know this is because I can see there's a lot of layers of the stratum corneum, but also deep to the stratum corneum, we have this light band of tissue or of cells. This is the stratum lucidum. So you only see the stratum lucidum in thick skin. So that's a second clue that we're looking at thick skin here. Deep to the stratum lucidum, you have the stratum granulosum, which typically stains as a dark border or a dark line on a microscope slide, and it very often will appear to be dark purple like you see here. So that's the stratum granulosum. Deep to that, we have the stratum spinosum, which consists of somewhere between 10 or 20 layers of keratinocytes. And these keratinocytes are becoming keratinized. They're developing bundles of keratin in their cytoplasms, and so they start to take on a kind of spiny or spiky appearance, which is where spinosum comes from. Deep to the stratum spinosum, we have one layer of kind of germ cells for the skin. This is the stratum basale or the stratum germinativum. This one layer of cells reproduces. One cell stays in this layer, the other one begins a migration towards the stratum corneum, and it changes as it goes. Deep to the stratum basale, we have our next layer of the skin. This is the dermis. So the dermis kind of goes from this point, just deep to the stratum basale, all the way down here to the border of the hypodermis. Okay, so all of this is the dermis. And remember, the dermis is made up largely of dense, irregular, collagenous connective tissue. But there is a bit of tissue superficially, which is more of the areolar connective tissue type. The hills that you see here that kind of poke into the epidermis, these are the dermal papillae, and as you can see, they feature capillary loops here. The red capillary loop is connected to the arteries of the body. They are bringing blood from the lungs to the tissues, where the oxygen from the blood will diffuse into the tissues, and then carbon dioxide from the tissues diffuses into the blood. And then that deoxygenated blood is carried via these little blood vessels, these little capillaries that are connected to your veins. and the veins are going to take that material away back to the lungs and heart. So these are blood vessels. They are specifically called capillary loops. Okay, blood vessels right here. Okay. Deep to the dermal papillae is where we're going to see our reticular layer of the dermis. It makes up about 80% of the dermis. So that's the reticular layer. You could say that this area around the dermal papillae corresponds to the papillary layer. Also in the dermis, we'll see other structures that are important. We see structures that look like this. This is an eccrine sweat gland. They produce watery sweat. It's like 99% water with some dissolved solutes and salts. The secretion happens down here, deep within the gland. The sweat then travels up through this duct all the way to the stratum corneum, where the gland opens up, or the duct rather, opens up to a funnel-shaped structure called the sweat pore. So these are sweat pores that you see. These aren't the only sweat glands that you see. It's not depicted here in this particular image, but there are also apocrine sweat glands. You'll know them when you see them because they resemble eccrine sweat glands, but instead of the duct going to the surface of the skin, it actually goes to the opening of a hair follicle. So we'll see that a little bit later. So it's not in this particular image. While I mentioned follicles, this is a hair follicle. It's responsible for producing hairs. So the brown that you see here, that's the shaft of a hair that's growing in this particular hair follicle. Surrounding the hair follicle, you have another gland. This is called a sebaceous gland. It secretes an oily substance called sebum, and that sebum lubricates the hair. It follows the hair follicle up to the surface of the skin where it comes out, and it also helps to lubricate the skin. So that was hair follicle. The brown part was the hair shaft, and then you have the sebaceous gland, this kind of blobby looking gland attached to the follicle. Okay, located there as well. Next to the sebaceous gland, you have a bit of smooth muscle here. It looks like skeletal muscle, but it isn't, because it does happen to be striated. But this is the erector pili muscle. When it contracts, it squeezes the sebaceous gland and makes that gland secrete sebum into the hair follicle, which again, the sebum is going to follow the hair follicle up to the surface of the skin. All right, we did that one already. Lastly, we have the Pacinian and the Meissner corpuscles. These are responsible for detecting pressure and touch in the skin. This is a Meissner corpuscle here. It's also called lamellated. This is the Pacinian corpuscle. Let me be clear. The Pacinian corpuscle. It is also called a lamellated or a lamellar corpuscle. And I don't know. Lamellated sounds like lamella, which we have in bone, and those correspond to layers. So that helps me remember that these Pacinian corpuscles are lamellated. The other thing I will tell you about them is that they tend to be pretty deep in the dermis, so that'll help you recognize them. Located here at the border between the dermis and the epidermis, we have the Meissner corpuscles. So this is another receptor that detects sensations like pressure and touch. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Let's take a look at another model. This is a different model. But let's identify the same structures here, just so that you can get used to recognizing these things. First thing I want to show you is this part of the model. This is thick skin. So remember on the last slide I told you that thick skin had lots of layers of the stratum corneum as well as the stratum lucidum. So the stratum lucidum is this kind of white layer running through here. That's how you know that this part of the model is demonstrating thick skin. Okay. For this model, the epidermis is all of this. Here we have thin skin, so notice that there's no stratum lucidum. Nope, no stratum lucidum here. We also don't have many layers of stratum corneum here, right? So we know this is thin skin. So for the thin skin portion of this model, the epidermis basically goes from the surface of the skin down here. Okay. Shall I do that for you one more time without all of the arrows? Thick skin, this is the epidermis. Thin skin, this is the epidermis. All right. So you are responsible again for the layers of the epidermis. Most superficially, you have the stratum corneum. Now, since we looked at thick skin on the last slide, I'm going to show you the same thing on the thin skin. So the stratum corneum is basically this pink layer that's very superficial right here. Okay. Deep to the stratum corneum, you have the stratum granulosum, which I'm not sure if you can tell, but perhaps if you look over here, you can see it's stained a little bit darker than the rest of the model. It's this little border right here. Okay. So that's the stratum granulosum. Deep to the stratum granulosum is the stratum spinosum, which is here. Remember, multiple layers of spiny shaped keratinocytes. And then the dark pink layer that you see here, this is the stratum basale or the stratum germinativum. All right, so that was the epidermis, the stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum. We saw the stratum lucidum here for the thick skin and the stratum corneum. Okay, can you find the dermis here? Of course you can. It looks very similar to what we saw on the last slide. So the stratum, the dermis basically goes from the basal surface of the stratum basale through all of this light pink material here down to the hypodermis. Okay, there is your dermis. You have the dermal papillae here. Again, they look like these little hills, right? And you see the capillary loops in there. That's the papillary layer of the dermis. Okay. The other thing that you probably noticed is this little yellow guy here. This is the Meissner corpuscle. Remember I told you it kind of pokes up into the dermal papillae. It's located between the border of the dermis and the epidermis. So that's the Meissner corpuscle. Let's look at structures in the dermis. First one that you'll notice over here is the eccrine sweat gland. Again, looks like a little bundle of mixed up spaghetti connected to a long duct that goes all the way up to the surface of the skin and opens up in a sweat pore. Okay, here's another one. So there's the bundle where secretion happens. Here's the duct going up, up to the sweat pore. So on this model, the sweat pore looks like little white dots on the superficial layer. Okay. Now remember that apocrine sweat gland I mentioned? Here it is. The large secretory region that looks a lot like the eccrine sweat gland, but if you follow the duct, it doesn't go to the surface of the skin, it opens up here in a hair follicle. So that's how you'll know that's an apocrine sweat gland. And remember, this makes a type of sweat. It's the type of sweat that gets kind of smelly because it has the goodies that bacteria want to metabolize. And this type of gland is only found in the armpit and the groin area. So we have thin skin, okay, but it's in the armpit and the groin. So that's kind of a clue as where we are in the body. Okay. Oh yeah, look, they've got it on the model here. It's in the armpit. All right, so that was the apocrine sweat gland. We have sebaceous glands in this model. If we look at this hair follicle here, you can see the kind of blobby outline of a sebaceous gland. Here's another one. Notice that the sebaceous gland opens up into the hair follicle. Again, so that sebum goes into the hair follicle and it follows the hair all the way up to the surface of the skin. The sebum lubricates the hair, lubricates the skin. So that was the hair follicle. The brown that you see extending from your hair follicle, of course, that's the shaft of the hair. And I'll just highlight this hair follicle just as a reminder of what we're looking at. I hope the purple works well. Can you see that purple? Here's the hair follicle. Okay, near the hair follicle where we have this sebaceous gland, here's the erector pili muscle. Remember what it does? It contracts to get the gland to secrete. Okay, so this is the erector pili muscle. Okay, Pacinian corpuscles, remember I told you they are located near the dermis, so they are down here. They look like they have many layers because they're lamellated, or they're also called lamellated corpuscles. Okay, so we did sebaceous glands, we did, so those are the Pacinian corpuscles, we did the pore. Okay. Reticular layer of the dermis, remember, it's basically the last 80% of the dermis, so down here. Okay. And then finally, we have the hypodermis. So the hypodermis is the deepest part of the model. Remember, again, not part of the skin, but you'll know it when you see it because it's full of fatty tissue and blood vessels. So this is the hypodermis. All right. Now the back side of this model shows you burns, and I didn't put this on your lab practical review sheet, but it could show up as like a bonus, so it's worth knowing. Remember that burns are categorized according to how many layers of the skin are affected. Your first degree burn is a superficial burn. It involves the epidermis. So if you look really closely, you can see that this is where the stratum basale is. So in this particular model, the burn is just localized to the epidermis. The second type of burn is called a second degree burn. This is where you usually see not just redness like the first degree, but you'll see blistering as well. Remember, this is called a partial thickness burn, and it's not just the epidermis, but also the dermis that are affected. So here is the border between the epidermis and the dermis. So you can see that the burn extends beyond the epidermis and into the dermis. The final burn over here, this is a third degree burn, also called a full thickness burn. Not only is the epidermis affected, it's destroyed, it's charred. The dermis also is affected, it's destroyed, and then the burn actually goes down into the hypodermis. So the hypodermis, remember, is down here. So we can see that it's affected, and the dermis and the epidermis up here are pretty much destroyed. So that's it for this model. So now I'd like to show you that what we see in the models is actually what happens in the skin. So on the left side of the slide, you'll recognize this is a plastic model from the lab. Some of the structures that I just want to point out, here's a hair follicle with a hair growing out of it. That's the hair shaft right here. We have the epidermis at the top of the screen. This is the dermis down here. And here's the hypodermis. You can see there's an erector pili muscle here, sebaceous gland, okay, and an eccrine sweat gland. Now on the right side of the slide is a section of someone's scalp that's been put under the microscope. And what I hope you can see is that this is a hair follicle. You can see the root and everything down here. Attached to the follicle, here's a sebaceous gland. Does it look like the sebaceous gland here? Maybe just from a different view, or maybe this sebaceous gland, kind of wrapped around the outside of the follicle. Here's the erector pili muscle. Okay, right next to the follicle, kind of like what we see on the right over here, and right next to the sebaceous gland. So there's the erector pili muscle, kind of in the same place. This set of circles that you see down here, this is the coiled spaghetti of an eccrine sweat gland. We just can't see the duct because of the way this section is cut, but you can hopefully visualize that if we were to take this sweat gland here and slice it kind of in the plane of your computer monitor, you would get a whole bunch of little circles like this, little tubules. Okay, there's a couple of hairs that are visible in these other hair follicles. That's a hair, and this is another follicle. You can see a bit of sebaceous gland over here attached. And here's a little bit of hair as well. Now up here at the top of your screen, this is the stratum corneum. It looks to me like the layers of a flaky biscuit. But remember, you've got multiple layers of dead keratinized skin cells, keratinocytes, that make that layer. You can kind of see that there's a dark line right here that runs deep to that. This is the stratum granulosum, same as this on the model here. Okay, the stratum spinosum is this layer in between that's just deep to that, so it's the gray layer on the model on the right, on the left rather. And then the stratum basale is this last layer of that's stained kind of dark purple. That's the stratum basale. And in this model on the left, it's the last layer of the epidermis. It's the same. This area here, this is all dermis. You can, if you look closely, you can see that it has that dense, irregular connective tissue quality. And then down here, you can see this is all adipose tissue. So this is the hypodermis, just like what you see over here. Now in this particular view, it's kind of hard to see the blood vessels because of the magnification, but if we were to look in areas like this or like this, we would probably see blood vessels there. I think this is one over here because I think I can see some red blood cells in it right there. So the models actually very closely represent what we see in actual skin. One last thing I wanted to mention, this is thin skin. How do we know? No stratum lucidum. Okay? All right, let's do a little practice exercise. Here is a model. There are 6 things for you to label. Take out a piece of paper, pause this video, write down the identities, the names of these 6 things. You want to try to do it with proper spelling, and then come back and let's write the names together. All right, here we go. Here are the answers. Did you get them right? So what you'll want to do is look at the figures that I've provided for you in your course space, and you need to be able to identify all of the structures from your lab practical review sheet on any of the models that you happen to see on the exam. So go ahead and study. Once you're ready, take the quiz in this course space, and then we'll move on to bone. See you at the next video.